There is something about a rumpled raincoat, a half-smoked cigar, and one more thing that has kept audiences utterly captivated for over 5 decades. Columbo, the beloved detective series that premiered in its full format in 1971, is one of the most ingeniously constructed television programs ever made. And yet, beneath its seemingly simple surface, beneath the shuffling walk and the absent-minded smile of Lieutenant Columbo, lies a treasure trove of secrets, behind-the-scenes decisions, hidden details, and remarkable stories that most fans have never heard. Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on 25 of the most fascinating secrets that have been hidden from the public eye for decades, and by the time we are done, you will never look at this show the same way again. Let us begin with perhaps the most fundamental secret of all, one that strikes at the very heart of the character himself. Peter Falk, the man who became synonymous with Lieutenant Columbo to such an extraordinary degree that it is nearly impossible to imagine anyone else in the role, was not the first choice to play the detective. When producer Richard Levinson and William Link first developed the character from their short story and subsequent stage play, they had a very different vision in mind. Bing Crosby was approached for the role. The legendary singer and entertainer was offered the part before Peter Falk was ever seriously considered. And Crosby declined because he reportedly preferred spending his time on the golf course to committing to a television series. Then Lee J. Cobb was considered. Neither man was chosen, and it was only through a rather winding path of casting decisions that Peter Falk arrived at a role that would define his legacy. When you understand how close the world came to never seeing Falk in that raincoat, the entire history of the show takes on a different color entirely. The raincoat itself is the second secret, and it is one of the most delightful stories in the entire history of production. That shabby, wrinkled, seemingly ancient beige coat that Columbo wears in virtually every single episode was not a wardrobe department creation, designed to suggest a man of modest means and disheveled habits. Peter Falk bought that coat himself. He paid around $15 for it at a second-hand shop, and he wore it to the very first production meeting, because he believed it was exactly right for character. The producers were not entirely convinced at first. There were discussions about giving Columbo something a little more presentable, something that might read better on camera. But Falk was immovable on the subject. He understood instinctively that the coat was not merely a costume. It was a psychological weapon. It disarmed the wealthy, sophisticated murderers that Columbo investigated, because they looked at that coat and they underestimated the man wearing it immediately. The coat, it turned out, was one of the most important pieces of detective equipment in television history. The third secret concerns something that viewers have been debating for decades without resolution, and that is the question of Columbo's first name. Throughout the entire run of the series, which stretched across different formats and decades, Lieutenant Columbo is almost never referred to by his first name. He is simply Columbo. His badge, however, tells a different story, and eagle-eyed viewers who pause at precisely the right moments over the years have claimed to make out the name Frank on that badge. But this was never confirmed officially by the show's creators, and in one episode a glimpse of what appeared to be his name on a document suggested something different entirely. The creators of the show maintained the ambiguity deliberately, understanding that the mystery of Columbo's full identity was part of his charm. He existed as a kind of every detective, a figure defined not by personal history, but by the purity of his investigative instinct. Here is the fourth secret, and it connects to something deeply theatrical about the entire premise of the show. Columbo operates on a storytelling structure that is the precise opposite of every other detective program that existed before it and most that came after it. In a traditional mystery, the audience does not know who committed the crime. The detective figures it out, and the audience discovers the truth alongside the detective. Columbo inverts this completely. The audience always sees the murder committed at the beginning of the episode. We know exactly who the killer is. The secret is not the identity of the murderer, but rather how Columbo is going to catch them. This structure, which the creators called the inverted detective story, was considered enormously risky by network executives who believed audiences needed the traditional mystery format to stay engaged. The creators argued the opposite, that watching a brilliant but seemingly bumbling detective slowly tighten the net around a clever, often arrogant killer was far more satisfying dramatically. They were right, and the proof is 5 decades of devoted viewership. The fifth secret involves the extraordinary caliber of actors who appeared as the murderers in Columbo episodes, and a rather surprising reason why so many major Hollywood stars were willing to appear on a television series at a time when film actors considered television beneath them. The secret is that playing the villain in Columbo was, for a certain kind of actor, an irresistible creative opportunity. The murderers in Columbo are almost always more intelligent, more educated, more socially polished, and more elaborately constructed as characters than the villains in any film they might have been offered at the time. Playing opposite Peter Falk in the cat-and-mouse dynamic that the show perfected gave actors like Jack Cassidy, Robert Culp, Patrick McGoohan, and Faye Dunaway a chance to do something genuinely complex. Patrick McGoohan, who won Emmy Awards for his appearances on the show, reportedly loved working with Falk so much that he returned to play different murderers on multiple occasions, something virtually unheard of in television. The sixth secret is about Peter Falk's glass eye, and it is simultaneously a medical fact and a piece of creative ingenuity. Falk lost his right eye to retinoblastoma when he was 3 years old and wore a glass eye throughout his entire life and career. Rather than attempting to conceal this or treat it as an impediment, Falk used it as part of his performance toolkit. The slightly unfocused quality of his gaze, the way he would turn his head at certain angles, the peculiar way he had of looking at people with an expression that suggested he was simultaneously present and somewhere else entirely. All of this was shaped in part by his physical reality. There is something particularly poetic about the fact that the greatest television detective of all time had a literal blind spot, and yet he never missed a thing that mattered. The seventh secret is that Columbo almost did not survive its first outing. Before the series proper began in 1971, there were 2 television movie pilots produced in 1968 and 1971 respectively. The 1968 pilot, called Prescription Murder, featured Falk in a role, but did not generate the immediate network enthusiasm one might expect given what the show eventually became. The 1971 pilot, Ransom for a Dead Man, was stronger, but even then NBC was not entirely certain the concept had legs as a regular series. The show was eventually folded into the NBC Mystery Movie Wheel format, rotating with other detective programs, which meant it did not need to produce a full season of 20-plus episodes per year. This reduced production schedule, which was itself born of network uncertainty, turned out to be one of the secret ingredients of the show's extraordinary quality. Each episode had the time and resources usually reserved for feature films. The eighth secret concerns the writing of the show, which was consistently among the finest on American television, and the remarkable fact that many of the scripts were written to a very specific psychological blueprint. The murderers in Columbo are almost always driven by a particular kind of arrogance, an absolute certainty in their own intellectual superiority. They commit what they believe are perfect crimes, and they are often contemptuous of Columbo precisely because he seems so obviously their inferior. The writers understood that this arrogance was not merely a character flaw, but the very mechanism of the murderer's destruction. It is their certainty that Columbo cannot possibly threaten them that causes them to keep engaging with him, keep answering his questions, keep trying to demonstrate their cleverness until the moment when the trap closes. In this sense, every episode of Columbo is a philosophical meditation on the dangers of intellectual pride. The ninth secret is that Peter Falk was deeply, genuinely invested in the character Columbo in a way that went far beyond professional commitment. He did not simply show up to deliver lines. He contributed substantially to the development of the character's mannerisms, his habits, his verbal tics, and his domestic life. The detail about Columbo's wife, for instance, who is referenced constantly throughout the series but never actually seen on screen, was developed collaboratively between Falk and the writers as a way of giving the detective a rich inner life that existed entirely off-camera. Mrs. Columbo became one of television's great running jokes, and also one of its most humanizing devices. She grounded a character who might otherwise have seemed almost supernaturally perceptive by connecting him to the ordinary textures of a working-class marriage. The 10th secret involves a dog, and here is where things get particularly charming. The basset hound that accompanied Columbo in several episodes, referred to simply as dog because Columbo never gets around to giving the animal a proper name, was not originally part of the concept. The dog was added because Peter Falk genuinely loved dogs and lobbied to include one. The animal that appeared in the episodes was not a single trained dog, but several different basset hounds over the course of the series, because the breed, while enormously appealing visually, is notoriously difficult to train and work with on set. The production team went through considerable effort to make the various dogs seem like a continuous character, which is itself a rather Columbo-esque detail, an elaborate deception hiding in plain sight. The 11th secret is about the show's music, which was composed by Billy Goldenberg and later became one of the most instantly recognizable television themes in history. The main theme was written to capture something specific about the character, a kind of deceptively simple melody that kept circling back on itself without ever quite resolving, much like Columbo's investigative method. The music was deliberately written to feel a little old-fashioned, a little Italian in its warmth and its slight sentimentality, connecting the character to his immigrant background and his working-class roots even before a single word of dialogue was spoken. The 12th secret is that the show was, in its way, a sustained piece of social commentary that most viewers absorbed without fully registering its political dimensions. The murderers in Columbo are almost exclusively from the upper classes. They are surgeons, conductors, film directors, wealthy businessmen, celebrated authors, and prominent academics. They live in beautiful houses, drive expensive cars, move through a world of privilege and refinement. And the man who brings them down every single time is a rumpled, apparently underpaid police lieutenant who drives a battered old car and eats chili for lunch. The show is, beneath its entertainment surface, a weekly demonstration that intelligence and moral authority are not the exclusive property of the privileged classes. The 13th secret concerns a car, that extraordinarily dilapidated 1959 Peugeot 403 convertible that Columbo drives throughout the series. The car was chosen for exactly the same reasons as the coat. It was meant to signal Columbo's apparent lowliness while concealing his actual capability. But what most viewers do not know is that the car became such an iconic part of the show that it was eventually donated to the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, where it can still be seen today. The car outlasted the show, outlasted the network, and in its battered, oil-leaking way, became one of the most famous automobiles in television history. The 12th secret is that the show was, in its way, a sustained piece of social commentary that most viewers absorbed without fully registering its political dimensions. The murderers in Columbo are almost exclusively from the upper classes. They are surgeons, conductors, film directors, wealthy businessmen, celebrated authors, and prominent academics. They live in beautiful houses, drive expensive cars, move through a world of privilege and refinement. And the man who brings them down every single time is a rumpled, apparently underpaid police lieutenant who drives a battered old car and eats chili for lunch. The show is, beneath its entertainment surface, a weekly demonstration that intelligence and moral authority are not the exclusive property of the privileged classes. The 13th secret concerns a car, that extraordinarily dilapidated 1959 Peugeot 403 convertible that Columbo drives throughout the series. The car was chosen for exactly the same reasons as the coat. It was meant to signal Columbo's apparent lowliness while concealing his actual capability. But what most viewers do not know is that the car became such an iconic part of the show that it was eventually donated to the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, where it can still be seen today. The car outlasted the show, outlasted the network, and in its battered, oil-leaking way, became one of the most famous automobiles in television history. The 14th secret is that Peter Falk and the show's creators had significant and sometimes heated creative disagreements over the years. Falk was not a passive performer who simply executed other people's visions. He had strong opinions about what Columbo should and should not do, what cases were worthy of the character, and how the detective psychology should develop. There were periods of tension between Falk and the network, between Falk and various producers, and between Falk and individual directors. The show survived these tensions because everyone involved ultimately understood that the character only worked when Falk was fully committed to it, and keeping Falk committed meant respecting his creative instincts. The 15th secret involves the famous catchphrase that everyone associates with the show, but which was never actually scripted as a catchphrase at all. The line, or rather the habit, of Columbo turning back at the last moment and saying just one more thing was an organic development that grew from Falk's improvisational instincts during early episodes. He discovered that the delayed question, the seemingly forgotten afterthought that turned out to be the most devastating question of all, was an extraordinarily effective dramatic device. The writers began writing it into scripts, but its rhythm and its timing were always Falk's own. The phrase became so famous that it entered the cultural vocabulary as a synonym for strategic afterthought, used by negotiators, lawyers, therapists, and conversationalists who have never seen a single episode of the show. The 16th secret is that several episodes of Columbo were directed by major film directors early in their careers, or by directors who were already established but found the show's format creatively stimulating. Steven Spielberg directed an episode called Murder by the Book in 1971, one of the series' very first episodes, and the experience is visible in the unusually cinematic quality of the direction. Jonathan Demme, John Cassavetes, and Nicholas Colasanto were among the other notable directors who worked on the series. The show attracted this level of talent because the combination of Falk's performance and the quality of the writing made it a genuinely prestigious production despite its television format. The 17th Secret is about the extraordinary number of Emmy Awards the show accumulated over its run, and the more interesting question of why it was sometimes overlooked for recognition that it deserved. Peter Falk won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series multiple times, but there were years when the show was arguably at its creative peak and failed to receive the recognition that a more fashionable or critically championed program might have received. The show existed in a peculiar critical middle ground. It was too popular to be considered art by those who equated obscurity with quality, and too good to be dismissed as mere entertainment. This ambiguity about its cultural status is one reason why its extraordinary achievement has not always been fully acknowledged. The 18th secret is that the show went through a significant hiatus between 1978 and 1989, and the reasons for this hiatus were more complicated than the official story of Peter Falk wanting a creative break suggested. There were contractual disputes, there were disagreements about the direction of the show, and there was a genuine question about whether the format had exhausted its possibilities. When the show returned in 1989 with a new series of television movies, it had been off the air for 11 years, and yet it returned as if no time had passed, with audiences embracing it immediately. This is one of the most remarkable comebacks in television history, and yet it is rarely discussed with the attention it deserves. The 19th secret concerns the international dimension of the show's success, which was far more extensive than most American viewers realize. Columbo was enormously popular in Japan, where it was broadcast under a title that translated roughly as Detective Columbo, and where it developed a devoted following that persisted for decades. The show was also hugely popular in Germany, in Israel, and across much of Europe. In many countries, it was more popular than it was in the United States during certain periods of its run. The international success of the show reflects something genuinely universal about its core appeal. The story of the underestimated man who is smarter than everyone who looks down on him is a story that translates across every cultural boundary. The 20th secret is about the finale of each episode, the moment when Columbo finally reveals how he knows the murderer is guilty, and the almost mathematical precision with which these revelations were constructed. The writers had a rule, which was that Columbo could only catch the murderer using evidence or observations that the audience had already seen on screen. There could be no sudden revelations of information that had been withheld from the viewer. Everything Columbo noticed had to have been available to the audience as well. This rule meant that re-watching episodes of Columbo was a genuinely different experience from watching them the first time, because the clues that Columbo was accumulating were always visible, always in plain sight, simply not assembled into their final pattern until the end. The 21st secret is that Peter Falk's preparation for each episode was legendarily thorough and somewhat unusual. He was known to arrive on set already deeply inside the character, sometimes to the point where it was difficult to distinguish between Falk, the actor discussing a scene, and Columbo, the detective working through a problem. He read extensively about the subject matter of each episode, whether it involved the world of classical music, the film industry, the medical profession, or academic life, so that he could improvise convincingly within whatever world Columbo was investigating. Several of his co-stars commented that working with Falk felt less like acting opposite another performer, and more like actually being interrogated by a very polite, very persistent, very dangerous police detective. The 22nd secret involves the strange and melancholy final chapter of the show's history, which is connected to Peter Falk's diagnosis with Alzheimer's disease in the last years of his life. Falk continued working well into the 2000s, but as the disease progressed, it became increasingly difficult for him to remember lines and to maintain the extraordinary concentration that the role required. The last official Columbo film was made in 2003, and those who were present during production have spoken about the bittersweet quality of watching Falk inhabit the character for what everyone knew might be the last time. His instincts still sharp even as other aspects of memory became unreliable. Falk died in 2011, and with him died any possibility of another appearance by Columbo, because unlike many television characters, this one was genuinely inseparable from a man who created him. The 23rd secret is that the show influenced the development of detective fiction in ways that are rarely fully acknowledged. The inverted mystery format that Columbo popularized was not invented by the show's creators. It had roots in the work of the British writer R. Austin Freeman and his Dr. Thorndike stories from the early 20th century. But Columbo translated this format for a mass television audience, and in doing so demonstrated that viewers were far more sophisticated than network executives assumed. Audiences did not need the artificial suspense of the unknown murderer to stay engaged. They were perfectly happy. In fact, they were more engaged, watching the process of detection rather than waiting for the revelation of identity. The 24th secret is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of all, and it connects to something that the greatest moral philosophers have always understood. Columbo works as a character because he represents a particular vision of how intelligence should function in relation to power. He is genuinely brilliant, but his brilliance is never deployed in the service of his own advancement. He takes no pleasure in humiliating the murderers he catches. He feels, in fact, a kind of genuine sympathy for many of them, and understanding that the flaws that led them to murder, the greed, the vanity, the desperate desire for control, are human flaws and therefore comprehensible even when they are not forgivable. His decency is not weakness. It is the source of his authority. In a television landscape full of detectives who are brilliant but damaged, brilliant but cruel, brilliant but morally compromised, Columbo remains one of the very few who is brilliant and good. The 25th and final secret is the simplest and perhaps the most profound. Columbo endures because it is, at its core, a show about paying attention. Every episode is a demonstration that the world is full of information that goes unnoticed by people who are too busy maintaining their self-image to actually observe what is in front of them. The murderers fail not because they are not intelligent. Most of them are very intelligent indeed, but because they cannot imagine that this disheveled, apologetic, apparently confused little man is actually registering every detail of their behavior, their word choices, their physical environment, and their emotional responses. Columbo sees what others miss because he has no vanity to protect, no image to maintain, no desire to appear impressive. He is free to simply look and think. And it turns out that looking and thinking, done with enough patience and enough genuine curiosity, is enough to solve every crime, catch every killer, and capture the hearts of audiences for more than 50 years. That, in the end, is the greatest secret of all.